Welcome back to Let's Talk Adoption. I'm Kim.
And I'm Heather. And I'm excited for today's show because this actually came up at a recent conference that I was speaking at. A gentleman asked, are there actual studies showing that open adoption is best for children?
It's a great question, and open adoption is often talked about in terms of feelings and stories, um, you know, anecdotal evidence, right?
Right,
Personal
right.
experience and client experience. But people want to know, what does the research say? Today, we'll look at a few studies and share what they found.
That's right. We dug into research to bring you some actual studies and results today. And I'll just start out by saying if you want to know more, you can find the names and information for the studies on the show page at letstalkadoption.com. We put everything we pulled from in the show notes, but I really wanted to take time and thoughtfully talk about this question that I couldn't really answer in the context of the adoption workshop I was teaching. So, where do you want to begin, Kim?
Yeah, well, let's start with a landmark study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family. It followed children in open adoptions over time and found that openness generally supports healthy identity development. Children valued knowing who their birth parents were, even if contact wasn't always frequent.
Right. And we talk about that when we talk to families, just how much children really need to know. They need to know the truth because when you know the truth, you can't fantasize about what might be, or there isn't. What did a woman tell me once, that their shame equals uh or shame and truth.
Secrecy, yes.
Yes. Secrecy equals shame. That's right. So, it's that was a great study that really was reflective of that they value knowing who the birth parents were. Another study in family relations looked at adoptive families over the first few years after adoption. And it really found that for adoptive parents, it helped them. It reported, I want to use the terms they used, overwhelming satisfaction with open adoption because it reduced anxiety and secrecy.
Hmm.
And these parents said that their children also benefited from honesty and clear information, which really is the clear information about where they came from and how their family came together.
Hmm. And Deborah Siegel's long-term research is especially powerful. She actually followed families from infancy into young adulthood. When those adoptees were interviewed as teens and later as adults, the majority said they preferred knowing their birth parents over not knowing. None felt that openness itself was a problem in their lives, though some reported challenges like navigating different levels of contact or handling complex emotions.
And that's a really important point because it acknowledges there can be challenges, but openness wasn't seen as harmful by the adoptees themselves. In fact, adoptive parents in that study, they reported that they remained committed to open adoption and said the benefits outweighed the difficulties.
Mhm. And another study published in Child and Adolescent Social Work Journal found that openness helps reduce feelings of abandonment and confusion in children. I mean, Heather, we have talked about this over the decades with, adoptive families and birth parents, and we've seen and heard the stories that adoptive parents share about parenting through open
Hmm.
adoption and the impact that it has on their child just knowing his or her own story and being able to maybe even have those conversations
Hmm.
with their birth mom in person. We have done webinars in the past and podcasts in the past where we were able to learn. And so now it's just so wonderful to just see this actual proof that open adoption really does help, that kids don't have to wonder, why was I placed? Because they can ask and often get answers directly. And one adoptive mom shared with us, Heather, years ago, that her son just seemed to stand a little taller and hold his head up a little more confidently, really have that conversation at that age directly with his birth mom and have her tell the story of why she made that decision for him. Even though he had known the story his whole life, it landed differently for him now as a young man entering into adulthood.
Right. And research also shows that openness can lower adoptive parents' fears. Now, I know we're really focusing on adoptees here, but you know, when the adoptive parents' fears are lowered, a child is going to know and pick up on, their adoptive parents' fear may not be the best word, but uncomfortableness, awkwardness, those are reduced. In closed adoption, parents sometimes worry about unknowns like medical history or, uh, you know, if the birth parents will show up one day, even with a closed adoption. So the openness allows for communication and reassurance really for everybody.
hmm And on one of our other recent podcast episodes, we interviewed Marianne Budden, and she talked a lot about some of those things that in her own personal experience as a mom, having that connection with the birth family really helped in something as simple as potty training. Because she
Ah,
was able to, yeah, talk with the birth family and ask what their experience was because she learned that well, I'll let her tell her own experience if you go listen to that episode with Marianne. She was awesome. I loved talking with her. But, back to the research. Now, while most of the research highlights benefits, we also need to be real. And this, I think, is where people have issues with open adoption because maybe their lived experience wasn't smooth, wasn't
sure.
easy. Maybe they know that open adoption would have been the worst thing for them.
Right.
And we need to acknowledge that openness isn't always smooth.
Right. And we say so frequently every adoption is unique, and certainly that's what we want to acknowledge here too. And the studies do note the challenges. They note sometimes birth parents fall out of contact, um, which may, you know, uh, produce unmet expectations. Or maybe an adoptee doesn't feel ready for a real relationship as they're getting older, especially in adolescence. That's a time where kids may pull back, not because the openness is bad, but because that's a time in human development when we all are navigating our own identity.
hmm Right. And I have just seen and know from personal experience how the desire for openness and the desire for more information and the desire to openly reflect that part of your identity ebbs and flows through the
Right.
years. And that's totally up to the adoptee. But
Hmm.
isn't it good to know they have that option?
Right.
If they don't have any information, they don't have the option as to whether or not they want that to be really part of their identity. They just have a kind of a gaping hole in knowledge about their own story and origin.
Right.
So, yeah, and let's not forget though, there are situations where boundaries can get crossed. For example,
Hmm.
if a birth parent makes promises they can't keep or says something that upsets the child, research shows that in those cases, families benefit from flexibility, renegotiating the contact plan, or even using a mediator. And I think it's really up to the adoptive parents to have that confidence that you're always going to be making the decisions with the child's best interest in mind, right?
Right.
And wanting to work things out and wanting to maintain contact if possible. But, if she's not following up, then perhaps, or if she's not following through with what she said, then perhaps she, just has to wait until the next time you offer to plan something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be something that revolves around the birth mom if she is not following through, but it is something that you want to try to maintain for the sake of the child. But I think that when it comes to your adoption, the root of how your adoption came to be really matters. For example, if you're
Mm-hmm.
adopting a newborn baby with a birth mom who chose you for her child, sometimes adoptive parents wonder, well, will the child feel neglected and rejected all over again if the birth mom kind of drifts off through the years? And we haven't really seen that because adoptive parents tend to not frame a birth mom as a mom who's not showing up to see them.
Mm-hmm.
They are the mom and dad, and the child is completely solid in their identity as the child of that mom and dad. And they also know they have a tummy mommy who planned adoption. And hey, if we get to go see her this year, then that's great. If she meets up with us, that's awesome. Either way, we're going to have a great day at the children's museum or at the restaurant that you love so much.
Mm-hmm.
But to not really don't build up an expectation when there's really nothing you can control in that scenario. It's
Right.
not in your control.
Right. And I love that you mentioned, renegotiating. It may not be that formal, but like you were saying, Kim, if she chose you and open adoption was her choice, you as adoptive parents have a commitment. Even if you have a 12-year-old that says, you know what, I want to play soccer, that's every weekend. And so, you're left unable to make the usual annual visit you make in, the designated month. That doesn't remove the obligation from keeping birth mom updated.
Hmm.
Or if a child, is saying, I don't want to go, we don't want to force in adolescence. But at the same time, those are where we have to have open conversations between the birth parents and adoptive parents. And, there can be a lot going on. And I'm glad you mentioned using a mediator. Often we encourage families to go back to the adoption professional because that helped them because they're usually in the best place to help on both sides. So
Hmm.
I think the general takeaway is that openness is most successful when everyone can communicate honestly, can, keep their commitments as best they can, respects those boundaries that hopefully you set early on, like maybe even before the adoption. And, at the heart of everything is putting the child first.
Hmm. Right. And there are situations when open adoption may not be best. So again, we want to acknowledge that this is not all just, we're not going to sugarcoat things. We want to
Right.
be The podcast is about going deeper into the reality of
Hmm.
adoption. And so this is
Hmm.
one of those things that it's important to say. Open adoption isn't always possible
Hmm.
or even best in every situation.
I want to take a moment to highlight our sponsor, the Lifetime Adoption Foundation, a nonprofit that's doing incredible work behind the scenes to support adoption in lasting, meaningful ways. Lifetime Adoption Foundation offers college scholarships for birth mothers, helping them take that next step in their future after making an incredibly selfless choice. The foundation also provides adoption education so that women and families have access to the information they need to make informed, thoughtful decisions. And through generous donations, they're able to provide grants to help with the placement of children who may face longer waits for adoption, which may include children who are older, part of a sibling group, or have medical needs. Be part of something that truly changes lives. Visit lifetimeadoptionfoundation.org to learn more or to make a tax-deductible contribution today.
You can see that Heather and I are advocates of open adoption, but what we're really advocates of is education. knowledge, doing what's in the best interest of the child, and empowering people to make those decisions for themselves. And this knowledge is power. And you can discern, hey, is open adoption in the best interest of my child? Am I making a fear-based decision to shy away from having that connection with birth mom? Or is it, really because of the facts? Are there reasons why open adoption shouldn't be
Right.
something that we, pursue?
Right. So let's talk about those facts. You may have planned on an open adoption, but perhaps something's come up that is a safety concern. There are times birth parents may struggle with, say, untreated addiction, untreated mental illness, um, which may lead to, a variety of things that may include erratic or violent behavior. And so maybe getting together for a visit isn't the the best until, they kind of have things a little better under control. And that can lovingly be shared. And you can still share updates. It's back to that, both and. It's not either or. Um, there are other cases like in foster adoption, where openness is definitely not even encouraged if there has been neglect and abuse, that an older child adopted, through the state, through the foster system, it may be shared that, it's not best to pursue open adoption because that may hinder a child's healing and processing of those traumas. But in those cases, typically open adoption isn't even on the table. I did hear a really interesting workshop at a adoption conference I went to this year, from a gentleman who adopted uh, two teenagers, and the session was about the contact he helped facilitate with they had two different mothers, with each of their mothers, and it was actually part of their healing. And it was interesting about helping navigate that because they also obviously were developing their identities. They were a little later in their teens, but it was just very interesting to know that even though traumatic situations happened when they were very young, depending on where birth mom is now, if she's even possibly in the picture, it can also be a point of healing and acknowledgement. But again, we have to always keep what's best for the child in mind.
When you were saying that, Heather, it made me think about the birth parent. Let's say that the child did come through the foster system and the foster system provided every opportunity you could imagine for that birth parent to get on track and, maybe go to some therapy, maybe get into a rehab program, maybe go to some parenting classes. Um, they were given every opportunity to create a home environment that would meet minimum standards, but that birth parent just didn't or wasn't able to follow that plan. And
Hmm.
so their parental rights were terminated, you know, most likely against their will. But I personally would hate if someone thought about me and judged me the way I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Not that I was a monster or anything like that, not that anyone is, but people can grow, they
Right.
can change. And so I think even if this was the root and the cornerstone of how your adoption came to be generous and give opportunity for the fact that perhaps things have improved in that birth parent and that maybe they do get to a point where they are healthy to have some kind of connection with. But that's something that you can discern as parents, if that is even an option. And a lot of times in the foster system, there's just no way to have the connection because there's not really a social worker that you can reach out to. There's not really a case file you can access. Sometimes things are
Right.
sealed. But we
Right.
also have to remember that sometimes birth parents are, and age isn't always an excuse, but sometimes they're really young and their behavior is a result of how they were treated growing up.
Mm-hmm.
But they still have that free will to,
Mm-hmm.
at some point, maybe make a change. So I would say be generous and leave open that possibility. And then there's another path to adoption that is, it really means open adoption is probably not going to even be on the table at all. International adoption. Openness often isn't an option simply because of distance or lack of ongoing contact with birth families. And in
Right.
those cases, agencies do their best to gather medical and family history, but direct ongoing contact usually just isn't realistic. I've heard that in recent years there has been a little bit of international adoption contact just because of the internet. If the agency that was involved in that country with that birth family has a record of who the birth parents are, that some adoptees in the US have been able to have video calls and have
Mm-hmm.
conversations with birth family, but that is so, so super rare. I think because if you look at the scenarios that bring a child to be adopted internationally, often there is abandonment. Often there is just no real record of intake with the birth parent
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
the child did appear somewhere or was
Right.
left
Was
somewhere
left.
and yeah was left and maybe brought to the agency or orphanage and so there's just really no way to trace anything um so with international adoption it's just usually not really an option.
Nope.
um
Nope.
yeah.
But I think the other thing just to keep in mind is sometimes a birth parent may have expressed interest in open adoption, but just isn't um, choosing to follow through or isn't able or even willing to participate. And it may be because she is stepping back for her own healing. It may just be too hard. And I would encourage adoptive parents to not take that as rejection or that she doesn't want it or that, well, she's not responding, so, that relieves us of our responsibility. Not at all. Typically, when I've worked with birth parents who have, in the words of adoptive parents, fallen off the face of the earth, it often is because of trying to heal, experiencing other traumas in their lives, um, slipping back into addiction, um, going to jail, having priorities that have shifted. I know. One time I was working with a family who got very concerned about their birth mom because she'd always been very diligent about staying in touch and helping plan their annual get together. And there was just nothing, nothing, nothing. So, I reached out in addition to them, and I had a little more, direct contact information. Found out her mother was dying of cancer, and she was prioritizing every minute she had with her mom and taking care of her mom, and it just that had to be her priority at that point in her life. So it doesn't mean that open adoption has failed if it uh, if the contact kind of ebbs and flows. It just means that that's a normal part of life. You look at your friendships and relationships over a period of time, they all ebb and flow. Um, and that's actually a normal, healthy relationship. And it may mean that, you may want to reset expectations together, but I think it's good just to realize that an ebb and flow is normal. Now, Kim, I want to talk about one more thing, and that is when children, the adoptees themselves, have maybe some special needs or special concerns, because that's another time where open adoption, um, the special needs in children may cause some some changes in how we planned for open adoption. You know, for instance, a child who is, say was adopted as a newborn and now at 3 or 4 is having developmental delays. You know, what you had planned to share about open adoption and meetups with the birth mom may need to change a little bit because of his needs. Um, Similarly, uh, if there are, as a child maybe gets a little older and maybe is having some struggle around the identity issues of adoption, may need to pause with that until he can, work with a therapist to get through some of those issues. But again, it doesn't relieve the responsibility of adoptive parents to update birth parents and to be honest about what's going on, and reassure her they're providing all the best care. But, you know, we also have to navigate that each adoptee has their own journey as they grow up.
Hmm. And I love that we're able to have this conversation and go into these deeper layers because this is all about understanding context and nuance and giving you the tools to navigate and make your own best decisions as adoptive parents or just to have the ability to support those around you who are touched by adoption. That if you hear that open adoption is best for children and then you see someone not doing it, well, you might not know the whole story. And so while the
Yes.
research shows strong benefits overall of open adoption, it's not a one size fits all. Openness works best when it's safe, consistent, and centered on what's healthiest for the child. And it works best that way. But good is also good, even if it's not the best case scenario, right?
Right.
Having what you can and ebbing and flowing and having that flexibility.
Right.
Um, and to preserve that if you can for the child, whether or not that's direct contact, you just sending updates and you don't hear back, putting updates aside in a file or a box somewhere if the birth mom isn't responsive, but you're still following through with what you promised, so that if she does come back around, you have that ready for her. And you can also show your child that you were following through, even though for her own personal reasons, she wasn't able to keep in touch sometimes.
Right. Right.
So back, yeah,
Well, I
Heather.
was just going to say, you mentioned setting aside the updates if she's not
Hmm.
getting back. That's something that's really important that, you know, I'm going to bring up something that is a little hard here, and that is not very often, but there have been a handful of times over the years where an adoptive family has not kept their commitment to open adoption. And one of the things that they often don't remember is that there's going to come a day where their child is going to be an adult and may choose to find their birth mom and reunite with their birth mom. And if the message they receive is your adoptive parents promised to send me updates, promised to have annual visits, and then never did, that's a reckoning that adoptive parents may have to face.
Hmm.
And I don't bring that up to scare or threaten or even do anything more than just acknowledge it because, as we both feel very passionately, very strongly about open adoption, I think what often disappoints me the most is when I hear adoptive parents have made that commitment and then not kept it. That is to me one of the one of the worst things you can do to someone. You know, if you have made that commitment, keep it. If you need to renegotiate it, get your agency or attorney involved but don't don't write the birth parents off.
Hmm.
Don't think that just because you don't hear from them, they don't want to hear from you. You made that agreement, you made that commitment. And that commitment wasn't just to and for your child. it was to and for those birth parents too. So, it's just it's just important to do. And like I say, if you need another reason, keep that one in mind. That day may come in the future. And for adoptive parents who have been through that exact scenario, it it has damaged the relationship with their child.
Hmm. Right. It's a covenant
It
between
is.
you and the birth mom who is trusting you with her baby or child.
Exactly.
So back to the original question. Do studies show that open adoption is positive for children?
And I think the answer is yes. Multiple studies, as we've shared, that have been done across decades, they show benefits for not just the adoptees, but also the adoptive parents and birth parents. But I know the question is for the children, so the answer
Hmm.
is yes. And the benefits are the strongest when the openness is handled with care, with honesty, with commitment, with flexibility, and always a focus on really not just the child's needs, but a focus on shared love for the child.
Hmm. And so if you're listening today and open adoption is something that you would love to learn more about and that you're imagining scenarios and wondering, what are the tools I'm going to need to best parent through open adoption and through adoption to make the best choices for the sake of my child. We're not going to be able to cover everything in just one podcast, but keep listening to all the episodes. We talk about this from a variety of different angles and at different points that you will encounter in your life as parents through adoption. So, stay tuned and keep seeking the information. Listen to personal experiences, read interviews, and that's what modern adoption is all about. It's learning, it's being open to the information. It's not a one size fits all model, but it's an approach that evolves as children grow. And I think that's just something we all have to be, open to if we're really doing what's best for a child.
Absolutely. So, thank you for joining us today. If you want to read more about the studies or read the studies themselves, as I said, we'll link them today in our show notes. If you have questions about anything we've talked about, you'd like to hear more about, you can contact us via the website, letstalkadoption.com. And, we love to hear from you. We love to answer your questions. And even if you need resources, we're happy to try to point you in the right direction.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on Let's Talk Adoption. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, please visit letstalkadoption.com. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. Until next time, take care and God bless.